16 October 1945. Dusseldorf. Karl Heinrich Müller wrote in his thin notebook, "We will rebuild on silence and paper, otherwise our children will not eat, and the men in uniform will ask again what we knew." The line was dangerous to speak aloud. It was honest enough to be true. It was a thesis written by hand in pencil on a single page that would later be folded into a pocket, lost and found, then cited in an interrogation in 1947. The sentence frames everything that follows. The city lay in ruins. The sentence lived in a ruined city. 1. October 1945. The rubble and the hands that clear it. The rubble told the first story. Streets were no longer streets. Avenue after avenue was a field of broken masonry, splintered doors, bent trams, and the blackened skeletons of houses. Short declarative image, no roof, no shop front, no church steeple hole. Then history expands. By October 1945, German cities were landscapes of total war. In Dresden, the February firestorm had carved a new topography. In Hamburg, the flames of July 1943 still marked block after block. Berlin's city centre was a diorama of collapsed apartments and tilted facades. Allied aerial photographs became maps for the living. The rubble had a geography and a workforce. They called them Trümmerfrauen. They were women who cleared rows of brick and wood with shovels, wheelbarrows, and a choreography of human muscle learned between the winter of 1945 and the spring of 1946. The name is literal, rubble women. Short sentence, then detail. Municipal reports, photographed by the occupying authorities and preserved in the Bundesarchiv, show the organized mobilization of female labor to clear transport arteries and salvage building material. The Trümmerfrauen worked without warm boots. They worked in shifts organized by neighborhood councils that were themselves newly constituted under occupation law. In Essen and Cologne, municipal minutes record lists of names, and the tonnage of brick moved weekly. Letters home, later collected in oral histories, give the texture, "We hauled the iron rails out with our teeth because the men were dead or missing," wrote Else Richter from Magdeburg on 24 March 1946. The letters are a ledger of exhaustion and necessity. Missing family members were a ledger of silence. Names blotted out. "My husband is missing," reads a tribunal entry from a Frauenverein file in Hanover, dated 4 November 1945. The word vermisst appears on thousands of municipal forms. War had not delivered clean accounts. Men returned in dribs and drabs. Graves were unknown. Army lists did not match the post office's lists. The arithmetic of absence shaped daily life. Kitchens that once cooked for extended households now cooked for one. Shops were shuttered. Oranges were a memory rationed in fiction. People learned to eat what they could get. Food became a calculus. Allied occupation forces entered with timetables and orders. Short sentence, then exposition. British armoured columns reached Lübeck and Kiel in early May 1945. American forces pushed into Bavaria by April. Soviet columns stood in Königsberg's ruins and later occupied the eastern provinces. Occupation forces brought curfews, checkpoints, and a new set of rules printed and posted in public squares. Posters ordered an end to sabotage. Batteries of military police inspected identity papers. Occupation reports, British military government daily summaries, American G2 reports, catalogued the fear of retribution. The fear had two vectors. One was fear of external retribution, reprisals against civilians, summary justice, and the unknown behavior of foreign soldiers in occupied houses. The other was fear of internal retribution, the newly empowered neighbors who would testify in Sprechkammer hearings, who might reveal who had been party members, who had profited off Aryanization, who had denounced Jews or laborers. Both vectors were recorded in intelligence summaries and in personal notebooks like Karl's. Fear became administration. Curfew orders were not merely security, they were a mechanism for control and a method of extracting labor. Curfew fixed the hours for food distribution and the hours people could be found for denazification interrogations. In an occupation report from the British Zone dated 12 November 1945, an officer wrote, "Curfew enforcement yields compliance for municipal registration. We have observed that families present themselves to the registrars during designated hours." The registrar was both witness and mediator. This is administrative history as experience. 2. The mathematics of hunger. Short sentence. Then, a ledger, ration cards, black markets, cigarettes as currency. The arithmetic of the empty stomach was the arithmetic of the post-war city. By late 1945, the German food supply had collapsed. Wheat imports had been cut, the transport networks were severed, and winter of 1946-47, severe and prolonged, transformed scarcity into crisis. The phrase hunger winter enters the records. Municipal food distribution offices issued Lebensmittelkarten ration cards that determined how much bread, flour, sugar, and margarine a family could receive. The cards were bureaucratic devices. They were also moral devices. They demanded an accounting of household composition and labor worthiness. In the denser parts of the city, citizens traded identity for calories. Occupation reports contained daily calculations. An American food supply memorandum for Württemberg, dated to 2 January 1946, lists allocations per person. 1,200 calories for a male worker if official employment could be proven. 900 calories for non-workers, special allotments for children under 6. The mathematics of hunger were not abstract, they were enforced with scales and stamps. Where the system failed, the black market flourished. Cigarettes, Konsumzigaretten, British and American rations, became portable currency. In a British intelligence summary from Hamburg, 8 March 1946, an officer notes that a pack of cigarettes could buy a kilogram of sugar on the black market. A ration card was paper. A cigarette was exchangeable energy. People used both. They exchanged cigarettes for fat, and fat for labor. The arithmetic of exchange read like this: 1 pack of cigarettes equals 1 pound of sugar. 5 packs equal a bushel of potatoes. 10 packs equals repair parts for a bicycle. Diaries give more intimate equation. I paid with 8 cigarettes for my son's shoes. An entry in a monster diary, 9 February 1946, reads, "The arithmetic of survival converted the moral economy into a market economy of necessities. The state and the occupiers attempted to regularize the distribution, but the arithmetic of shortage always outpaced public policy." 3. Denazification and the mathematics of guilt. Short sentence. Then a process unfolds. Denazification began as legal and moral purge. It became a bureaucracy, then a negotiation. The Sprüchkammer hearings in the western zones were courts of the occupation administering the so-called Fragebogen, the denazification questionnaire. The category structure was explicit: Hauptschuldige, major offenders; Belastete offenders, Minder Belastete; lesser offenders, Mitläufer followers, and Entlastete, exonerated. Each label was a variable in a social equation that decided who lost a job, who lost civil rights, who went to prison, and who could return to an office desk. Anchor to a human moment. 14. February 1946. Cologne. Bürgermeister Mayor Heinrich Weber sat before the Sprüchkammer. He had been a party member since 1933, had signed municipal eviction orders in 1942, and had organized wartime rationing according to party lists. He had a wife and two school-age children. He wrote in his questionnaire, "I joined because work demanded it. I kept the city functioning." Short sentence. Then analysis. The Spruchkammer took testimony from neighbors, reviewed municipal correspondence, and processed Weber's oath. The court assigned Weber to category Belastet initially. He received a 7-year professional ban. He appealed. In November 1947, an Allied occupational review reduced his sentence to a 3-year ban on holding public office. The municipal council rehired him in 1949 as an administrative advisor. Records in the Landesarchiv Nordrhein-Westfalen show the exchange, petitions, signed testimonies of neighbors, and a succinct note from an American officer citing a need for administrative continuity. The arithmetic of guilt had entered into arithmetic with utility. The mathematics of guilt was not only legal, it was statistical and practical. The figures are stark. Millions completed the Fragebogen. In the Western zones by 1948, the number of people initially classified as offenders collapsed under appeals and re-evaluations. Historians have compiled the arithmetic. In the American zone, hundreds of thousands were screened. Only a few thousand served long sentences. Many were reclassified as Mitläufer. These reclassifications did not happen because evidence vanished. They happened because the occupation authorities rebalanced priorities. Documents show rationales. Stability necessary, reads a note in an Allied intelligence summary from Frankfurt, April 1947. We face difficulty recruiting qualified personnel otherwise. The mathematics of guilt therefore interwove with the mathematics of reconstruction. Ordinary people reshaped their pasts in formularies. The Fragebogen demanded remembrance and self-placement. Many answered with the language of following orders. "I followed orders" appeared on countless forms. The phrase was not merely a legal defense, it was a social accounting strategy to minimize the matrix of culpability. Social historians note a pattern. The more administrative and the less ideological the role, the more likely a person was to claim passive compliance. Teachers in Reutlingen wrote identical lines in their files. "I taught what the state required. I never endorsed the excesses." These confessions were, in many cases, half-truths. They were also pragmatic. The Spruchkammer had to adjudicate a workforce amid a shattered nation. Allegations of high-level criminality were reserved for concentration camp personnel, SS lists, and industrialists who'd overseen forced labor. Most municipal employees were judged against the arithmetic of need. The Spruchkammer hearings could be performative. They were also tactical. Allied reports describe an evolution. Initially, the British and Americans pushed for rigorous purges. Then, as the Cold War calculus sharpened, the tone changed. A 1948 Allied assessment of the denazification effort in the American zone notes exhaustion of the process and the need for rehabilitation of useful personnel. The arithmetic had shifted. The mathematics of denazification was not one of moral absolutes. It was a vector in a larger political and logistical equation. 4. The expulsions and the arithmetic of space. Short sentence. Then a human tide. The Potsdam Conference, 17 July to 2 August 1945, authorized the transfer of German populations east of the Oder-Neisse line. Orderly and humane was the phrase, recorded in the agreement. History complicates the phrase. Between 1945 and 1948, an estimated 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled or fled from territories that were to become Polish and Soviet jurisdiction. Silesia, Pomerania, East Prussia. They arrived in towns already scarred. Trains came with the living, with sacks and small bundles, with children clutching bread. The reality was an arithmetic of rooms, anchor to a station. 3. March 1946. Lübeck Hauptbahnhof. A freight train disgorged 1,200 people from Königsberg. The municipal registry recorded names, causes, and complaints. Frieda Bauer, who kept a diary and later testified in an oral history interview in 1972, wrote, "They came out wrapped in blankets. They had shoes on their hands. They spoke differently. We stared. The stares were documentation. While people looked, municipal authorities counted beds." Housing offices produced forms that depicted rooms as units that could be subdivided into family shares. The arithmetic of scarce rooms is an administrative phrase with human cost. One small apartment could be partitioned with boards into 3 households. This was recorded in municipal planning notes in Göttingen in May 1946, where a housing officer wrote, "1 room per family equals desperation. We must allocate 6 adults per 5 rooms until resettlement ceases." Tension between locals and newcomers was predictable and recorded. Local newspapers documented protests and altercations. In a British military government report from Hanover dated 15 May 1946, officers described incidents where expellees clashed with locals over food queues. The arithmetic of resources measured in rations, in jobs, in shelter, could be rendered as simple fractions. A town with 20,000 before the war now housed 35,000. The denominator changed, but the numerator, shops, schools, jobs, did not keep pace. Jobs were scarce. Factories prioritized existing employees. The job market's arithmetic forced many expellees into informal labor or itinerant work. Some women found work as Trümmerfrauen. Some men worked as day laborers on rebuilding projects. Municipal minutes from Munich list the daily wage for a laborer in 1946 and the implied consumption it could sustain, a kind of poverty math. The expellees carried with them their stories. They also carried blame and bitterness. Some local narratives cast them as intruders. Expellee organizations lobbied for restitution of property and for compensation. Political scientists later called the post-war years a competitiveness of victimhoods, a contest for moral and material recognition. The arithmetic of suffering became a political currency in the nascent Federal Republic debates, especially as the 1950s saw institutional recognition for Heimatvertriebene, expellees, and their integration into politics. 5. Contact with the displaced persons. Short declarative scene. April-May 1945. Bergen-Belsen. The British liberated the camp on 15 April 1945. The images were documentary. Short sentence, then context. The liberation stunned not only Allied soldiers, but also German civilians who encountered the camps afterward. Photographs taken by British press photographers and distributed by the Allies circulated in Germany. Soldiers forced local populations to view the images as part of a process of confronting local complicity. The Allied policy was deliberate to create incontrovertible evidence. Intelligence summaries recommended organized showings for German viewers. Displaced persons, DPs, were housed in camps across the zones. Jewish survivors, former forced laborers, and POWs were among them. Feldafing, near Munich, became a DP camp with a high proportion of Jewish survivors. Nearby German towns saw survivors in striped clothing or in tattered civilian clothes. Short sentence, then expansion. The camps were often in requisition barracks or in former barracks that had housed Wehrmacht units. The proximity was deliberate. Occupation reports record a policy, isolate but make visible. German townspeople visited the outer fences. They saw men and women standing in line for soup. They saw burned numbers tattooed on forearms or empty chairs in communal huts. Some Germans reacted with shock, others with calculation. Moments of confrontation are recorded in both German testimonies and Allied intelligence prints. In a British military government report dated 25 April 1945, a commanding officer wrote of a scene in Schelle where he compelled local Volkssturm members to accompany the party to the camp to witness the dead and the living. The command was punitive and pedagogical. Many Germans later wrote in letters or in Spruchkammer testimony that they had never known the extent. "We saw the stacks of shoes," a man from Braunschweig wrote to a district office in May 1945. "I could not imagine such things," he added. That statement's honesty is multidimensional. Some had indeed not seen, some had refused to see. Many Germans developed strategies of denial or of selective memory. Denial had administrative shapes. Municipal archives preserve lists of citizens who stated, under oath, that they had no knowledge of anti-Jewish measures beyond the Nuremberg decrees and anonymous newspapers. The psychological calculus of denial, what people chose to remember and what they chose to forget, entered into the mathematics of social restoration. The calculation could be formalized. Recognition of victimhood led to potential loss of status, whereas denial allowed continuation in positions. Occupation officers noted this pattern in intelligence summaries as early as 1946, where visible evidence is absent, wrote an American investigator in a report to the G2 office in Stuttgart. There is a rapid move towards collective amnesia. Contact also created human encounters that altered lives. Former forced laborers were hired in German factories after a period in DP camps. In some towns, former Polish laborers remained as paid agricultural workers. Testimonies record gestures of mutual aid. A German woman sharing bread with a Jewish survivor in Feldafing, a disabled former POW being assisted onto a tram by a German shopkeeper in Nuremberg. These small acts complicate any simple moral accounting. They are recorded in oral histories and in photographs captioned in Allied intelligence reports. The contact produced cognitive dissonance. The living speakable horror existed next to the ongoing tasks of civic repair. 6. The reconstruction. Calculus, Marshall, currency, and Karl's desk. Short sentence. Then policy. The transition from rubble to recovery was not instantaneous. It required foreign capital, currency stabilization, and institutional restructuring. The currency reform of 20 June 1948 in the Bizone, later joined by French zone, replaced Reichsmark notes with Deutsche Mark. The reform recentered economic incentives. Short sentence then detail. The currency reforms slashed money supplies, invalidated many savings denominated in Reichsmark, and also eliminated the black market's easy arbitrage. Allied economic reports indicate immediate increases in market transactions and in industrial output. The Marshall Plan, European Recovery Program, launched in April 1948 and rolled out into deliveries by 1949. American shipments of machinery, grain, and raw materials are documented in shipment manifests preserved in Washington and in German customs records. The influx of capital and materials fed a nascent industrial boom. The phrase Wirtschaftswunder is shorthand for this recovery. Its first signs were visible in small factories, in rebuilt railroad lines, and in an uptick of Karl-Heinrich Müller reappears with a job. He had been a clerk before the war and had worked in a municipal office clearing rubble in early 1946. Anchor to a date. 4. March 1949. Düsseldorf City Hall. Karl received a letter offering him employment as a Sachbearbeiter in the new municipal office for housing allocation. Short sentence, then internal life. He would sit behind a desk with a ledger book. His work was to process housing applications, allocate provisional rooms to expellee families, and ensure that ration cards matched municipal registries. The tasks required procedural competence and an aptitude for being quietly decisive. Karl took the job. He recorded the choice in his notebook on 6 March 1949. I signed for order. I signed for order. I signed to feed my daughter. The new democracy needed functional administration. The Bundesarchiv contains personnel rosters showing a pattern. Many former low-level NSDAP members were rehired into municipal and state offices because they possessed the institutional memory, and technicians were scarce. Denazification files show name after name of those initially barred and later reinstated because their skills were defined as essential. The mathematics of governance, therefore, included compromises. These compromises are visible in cabinet lists and municipal hire letters. They are also visible in the faces of citizens who queued for licenses and permits. The new order ran on paperwork and on the tacit bargains that allowed bureaucracies to function. The old Weber case is a specimen. He re-enters the municipal office as an advisor. He does not issue propaganda anymore. He calculates allocations. He signs ration documents with the same hand that once signed eviction orders. Historians have used such trajectories to describe the bureaucratic continuity that underpinned post-war reconstruction. The archival evidence is precise. Cross-referenced municipal letters show rehiring recommendations, often citing uninterrupted serviceability and no evidence of direct involvement in war crimes. The mathematics of compromise weighed the cost of full purge against the cost of paralysis. 7. Public memory, schoolbooks, and the arithmetic of commemoration. Short sentence. After institutional needs, memory politics took stage. How a society remembers is partly symbol, partly policy. Schoolbooks printed in the early 1950s reflected a simplified narrative. They emphasized German suffering, the bombed cities, the thousands of refugees, the lost homeland of the East, and often relegated culpability to a vague past. A history textbook used in many West German schools in 1952 treats the Nazi period as a catastrophe that German society suffered, with chapters on air raids and expulsions occupying far more space than chapters on anti-Semitic policies or forced labor. The effect is measurable. Curriculum directives archived in Education Ministry files list suggested page allocations. The arithmetic of pages becomes an arithmetic of moral importance. Public commemorations followed similar patterns. Memorials like the war graves for German soldiers, the annual Volkstrauertag, and later the foundations for expellee culture foregrounded German loss. The Bunde der Vertriebenen formed in 1950, lobbying for expellees. Their public accounts emphasized the suffering of ethnic Germans. Memorials to victims of Nazi crimes were slower to appear in public squares. Where they existed, they were often framed as local tragedies rather than systemic crimes. The selective public memory emerges from the interplay of diaspora politics, the need for national cohesion, and Cold War realignments. The mathematics of memory involved choices about what to count. Who counted as a victim? Who counted as a perpetrator? The numbers of dead soldiers, the numbers of refugees, the tons of destroyed housing were archival and thus politically usable. Historians later compared archives of displacement with archives of deportation and forced labor. The comparison produced discomforting ratios. For every missing Jew the state counted as deported, there were thousands of Germans who claimed missing husbands and sons. Both claims were recorded, both needed humanitarian responses, and the state had to calibrate response amid scarcity. The arithmetic of recognition became contentious. 8. The Cold War and the arithmetic of alliances. Short declarative sentence. Then, geopolitics. The onset of the Cold War reshaped the occupation's priorities. By 1947–1948, the Western Allies were less intent on a complete social cleansing and more intent on creating a bulwark against Soviet influence. This realpolitik is visible in policy memos. A U.S. State Department cable in July 1947 argues for stabilizing West Germany as a democratic partner. The words stability and reliability recur in the language of policy. Denazification's harshest measures were relaxed. The mathematics of guilt was subordinated to the arithmetic of alliances. This realignment had consequences on the ground. Former Wehrmacht officers and conservative bureaucrats became useful as administrators in the new Federal Republic structures. The Western Allies prioritized reintegrating West Germany into Western European economic frameworks, culminating in the creation of the Federal Republic in May 1949 and of NATO participation in the following years. These strategic moves are recorded in diplomatic cables and occupation policy statements. Local files show the results: employment rehabilitations, early release from internment, and the reintegration of industrial leaders into economic planning. For many civilians like Karl, Cold War calculations were felt as pragmatic choices rather than geopolitical doctrines. "We needed to feed ourselves," he wrote in 1950. "We needed coal. The Allies said this was the prize to get." The calculation was literal. Supply lines were tied to political alliances. The Marshall Plan required political alignment. The arithmetic of access to goods shaped political alignments inside Germany. Municipal council minutes in Bonn and Dusseldorf from 1949 reference the strategy: accept the aid, rebuild the factories, keep order. 9. Personal stories, small documents, large consequences. Short sentence, then names. The story of post-war Germany is a collection of small documents: a postcard, an interrogation report, a hospital ledger. Each produces a narrative when read against others. Consider the case of Liesel Hartmann. She was a teacher in Potsdam in 1939, a member of the NSDAP who taught biology with Nazi textbooks. After 1945, she appeared before a Sprüchkammer on 22 August 1946. She filled the Fragebogen, confessed to party membership, and claimed no involvement in racial policies. The tribunal placed her in Minderbelastet and imposed a salary reduction. In 1948, she appealed and was reclassified as Mitläufer under the argument that she was an apolitical professional. Her school employment was reinstated in 1950. The personnel file preserves the letters. Liesel's case is not an exception. It is a representative vector. The files show patterns. Many who had been local functionaries in the Nazi system returned to teaching, to municipal finance, to municipal cultural positions. The process created ongoing moral tensions in classrooms. Students learned sanitized versions of history. Teachers like Liesel adapted the curriculum to emphasize wartime suffering rather than anti-Jewish policy. The local school board minutes in Potsdam from 1951 record discussions over which texts were acceptable, with the conclusion: textbooks should avoid inflaming political controversies and rather instruct for peace. Consider another small document, a letter from Martha Weiss, who survived Auschwitz and returned to her pre-war town of Katowice in 1946, found family houses occupied by Germans, and then moved on to DP camps in the American zone. In her letter to an aid agency dated 12 September 1946, she wrote, "They say they did not know. They look at us as if we were a story." The letter was catalogued in an Allied Relief Agency registry. It was one among tens of thousands of letters. The registry became testimony that later served as evidence in trials and in historical scholarship. The documents function like nodes in a network of memory and denial. 10. The arithmetic of integration and the new normal. Short sentence. Checks. Then social data. Through the early 1950s, the Federal Republic instituted policies to integrate expellees, to stabilize wages, and to rebuild industrial capacity. The social market economy, advocated by Ludwig Erhard and implemented through social policy, created welfare mechanisms, low tariffs, and an environment for private enterprise. The numbers changed. Industrial output increased. Unemployment fell. The math of production replaced the math of scarcity. Coal production rose in the Ruhr. Steel mills in Duisburg fired up blast furnaces with new coking equipment delivered through Marshall Plan assistance. The files show the sequence: shipments, installation, production, and employment. But integration had costs. The social fabric needed mending. Expellees often segregated into particular neighborhoods. Housing offices recorded enclaves by origin: Silesians in one district, East Prussians in another. The arithmetic of belonging became geographic. Local accounts reveal social friction, competition over school places, over municipal practice, and over cultural recognition. The Bund der Vertriebenen's activism shaped national memory politics. Integration was often contingent on acceptance into a common narrative, emphasizing future prosperity and a vaguely shared victimhood. Karl at his desk had to ration empathy. He allocated rooms and ration cards. He signed papers that allowed families to apply for loans to rebuild. He watched the city's streetcar lines roar back. In 1952, he bought a small radio. He listened to the news about the coal strike, to the Chancellor's speeches, to the football matches. He also kept his notebook. It remained a private ledger of his compromises. He noted the names of those he had rehired, the names of those who had been convicted, and the names of those who had died from starvation in 1947. The effect of doing the paperwork was cumulative. The desk produced official orders and private memory. 11. The social science of silence. Short sentence. Then analysis. Silence can be a social technology. Sociologists and historians later called the years 1945–1960 a period of selective silencing, a gap between private memory and public narration. The silencing was maintained by multiple mechanisms: legal amnesties, political necessities, educational choices, and social reprisals against those who insisted on public reckoning. Oral histories collected decades later reveal this pattern. In interviews conducted by university teams in the 1980s, several citizens recounted being socially ostracized for speaking openly about wartime collaboration or for challenging local elites. Court files from libel cases in the 1950s show that allegations about past misdeeds could become grounds for legal action. The arithmetic of silence thus included penalties. The mathematics of silence can be modeled. For a family, silence has a benefit function: stability and social inclusion, BS, versus moral cost and psychological burden, CSCSCS. For many, BSCSCSCSCS in the immediate post-war years because benefits had immediate, tangible returns: food, work, social reintegration. The costs were deferred and intangible: guilt, nightmares, the slow erosion of conscience. For a municipal official like Karl, the equation included the welfare of dependents. His notebook entry, "We will rebuild on silence and paper," is a compact notation of this calculus. He wrote as a man trying to maximize a function of survival. The phrase is a human version of cost-benefit analysis. 12. The memory of violence, local reckonings, and the limits of justice. Short sentence. Then legal event. The Allied prosecution of major Nazi criminals at Nuremberg functioned as an international reckoning. It set a legal precedent and produced a set of records in indictments, affidavits, and trial transcripts. But justice on the local level was partial. Local trials for war crimes were scattered, some prosecuted under Allied authority, some under newly constituted German courts. The numbers are informative. Post-war trials in German courts and in Allied courts resulted in varying sentences. Clemency and commutation altered many outcomes. The Spruchkammer system itself was unsuited to trying mass atrocities. Its jurisdiction targeted political affiliation and administrative roles. Concentration camp guards, SS leaders, and industrialists were tried in special proceedings, but many middle-level perpetrators escaped sustained punishment. Examples illustrate the limit. A local factory manager in Essen was alleged to have used forced labor in 1943–44. His case entered a British investigative file in 1946. He produced work orders and records that shifted culpability towards ephemeral German bureaucracy rather than personal initiative. By 1949, the British decided not to pursue prosecution, citing insufficient manpower to convict at scale, and noting the need for the factory's revival. The denouement appears in occupation paperwork and in correspondence between the British military government and the municipal office. The manager was reinstated in 1951 and rose to be a board member in the 1950s. The case is morally complex. The documents do not exculpate him. They show how justice was limited by political and economic priorities. 13. Longitudinal voices, oral histories, and the archive of the everyday. Short sentence. Then method. The reconstruction of post-war civilian life depends heavily on the archive of the everyday. Letters, diaries, school registers, municipal ordinances, and oral histories recorded decades after the events. These sources provide contradictory textures. For some, the period is remembered as heroic rebuilding. For others, it is a time of moral vacancy. A 1981 oral history with Anna Baumgartner, a Trümmerfrau who later married an expellee from Silesia, recorded this contradiction. "I felt proud of the bricks we moved," she said, "and ashamed for the things I had not asked when I saw the photographs of the camps." Her voice modulates pride with the memory of photographs that later arrived in local newspapers. Historians treat these personal narratives as data points. They are not neutral. The interview context, the subject's age, and the interviewer's agenda all shape memory. Nevertheless, when cross-referenced with municipal records, the oral testimony creates a fuller image. Federated archival projects, German Landesarchiv, Bundesarchiv, Allied holdings in the National Archives US, and the Public Record Office US and the Public Record Office UK, have digitized many of the central documents. The denazification records, Spruchkammer files, and occupation reports are often fragmented but cross-correlatable. A historian reading these materials must practice triangulation. A name in a Spruchkammer file, corroborated by a municipal employment ledger and by a neighbor's testimony, forms a stronger narrative. The mathematics of historical argument here is probabilistic. Patterns emerge. They show that the past was not a simple sheet of black and white. It was a palimpsest of administrative continuity, social negotiation, and personal survival strategies. 14. Cultural shifts and the slow recognition of Jewish suffering. Short sentence. Then cultural process. For many Germans, the realization of the full scale of the Holocaust was gradual and incomplete. Allied films and newsreels attempted immediate exposure, but the social reception was mixed. Early German cinema and theater often depicted war trauma as generalized suffering. The turning of culture towards explicit engagement with Jewish suffering only picked up pace in the 1960s, with films and plays that broke silence publicly and nationally. Student movements in 1968 forced public discussions and prodded institutions to recognize complicity. The intervening years were filled with partial gestures. In some towns, Jewish cemeteries were preserved and marked early by local initiatives. In others, Jewish heritage sites were repurposed or left derelict. Memorials to Jewish victims were patchy and often motivated by international pressure or local guilt. The persistence of silence had psychological effects. Survivors who remained in Germany or turned to other countries found memorialization slow and often insufficient. 15. The arithmetic of compromise, reconciliation, forgetting, and the price of growth. Short sentence. Then, debate. Repairing infrastructure and creating a viable polity demanded compromises. The calculus is visible in electoral politics. Adenauer's coalition included conservative elements that prioritized integration into the West. Rehabilitating former low-level functionaries in administration made practical sense. The social cost of this inclusion was the non-confrontation of many actors in the Nazi system. Historians have argued that the Federal Republic's early success in economic and political terms came at the cost of delayed moral reckoning. The documents show the trade-offs, policy papers describing amnesty and restitution. Programs were paired with memos noting the need for efficient staffing of municipal offices. Karl's life followed this pattern. He advanced modestly. By 1955, he had a mortgage and a rebuilt apartment building to his name. His notebooks now included ledger balances and the names of families he had rehoused. He also kept a separate page with an older pencil scrawl, 16 October 1945. "We will rebuild on silence and paper." He would sometimes fold that page into the pocket of his jacket and feel a small prickle of unease when the radio announced a speech about German suffering. He kept quiet in public and wrote small sentences in private. The practice was survival. It was also a form of social complicity. 16. The new generations and the problem of inheritance. Short sentence. Then social effect. Children born in the 1950s and 1960s inherited a narrative that was both proud and limited. Schools taught a sanitized national story. Families told stories of hunger and loss, rarely the stories of perpetration. Sociological studies in the 1970s and 1980s recorded the generational tension. Younger citizens asked hard questions their parents evaded. The public debates about collective guilt and memory intensified with the Eichmann trial in 1961 and with the Auschwitz trials held in Frankfurt in the 1960s. These events broke some of the silence. Public hearings and trials moved the private ledger into public space. The mathematics of intergenerational transmission involve both emotion and civic institutions. Parents transmitted practical survival strategies, frugality, stoicism, respect for authority. Schools and state narratives transmitted a partial civic memory. The sum of these transmissions created a society that could achieve economic success, but that struggled with traumatic memory. The tension would re-emerge in the 1960s protests, but its roots were visible earlier in municipal minutes, in Spruchkammer reversals, and in the hesitancy of commemoration policies. 17.